North Carolina General Assembly already has generated some significant news in its first couple of months of work this year. One of the most astute observers of legislative action is our next guest, Western Carolina University political science professor Chris Cooper. He joins us now to offer some analysis of the legislature's work to date. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks, Mitch.
So, first of all, just your overall impression about how things have been going on. This session seems to be going pretty quickly.
It does seem to be going quickly. We're seeing a lot of familiar legislation come through. I mean, it rhymes with the last session, right? You're seeing many of the same issues, whether it's Medicaid expansion, sports gambling, which is fascinating, and then a lot of these local bills that I've been following really closely, a lot of them having to do with elections that continue to be brought up cycle after cycle. So there's a lot of action with the big ticket items, but I think let's not lose track that local bills still matter in North Carolina too.
You've already mentioned Medicaid expansion. The big difference this time around is there's a bill.
Right.
As we're speaking, it's about to get its last vote and head to Governor Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of the fact that they've actually reached a deal this time after years of nothing?
Yeah, I mean, one, I'm as fascinated as anybody else is, and certainly I don't have the magic sauce that says why Berger changed his mind. But I don't know. I think it's interesting from a couple of levels. One, the inter-chamber dynamics, right? So we talk, of course, a lot about Republicans versus Democrats, but the final push on Medicaid expansion, I think, was really less partisan and more about the differences between the chambers. And so one thing it tells me is that even if you've got near supermajority control, that doesn't mean you're going to be unified on every issue. With that said, of course, they did finally come around. I believe, Phil Berger, that some of the data changed, some of the information changed, and the way he looked at it changed as well. Of course, we'll see when the budget comes out exactly how these details look.
You bring up an interesting point because one of the things we've heard on the congressional level is sometimes people see the other party as the opposition, but the other chamber as the enemy.
That's right.
And it's interesting to see how that plays out in the legislature, too.
Yeah, it really does, and I think we should pay more attention to that. I mean, the House is 120 folks, right? It's a rowdier place. I mean, they may not be yelling more, although they actually do, but it's just a harder body to control in a lot of ways. And obviously, Berger and Moore are aligned ideologically, but that does not mean that they are carbon copies of one another.
We've already talked a little bit about the budget. The fact that this is moving forward fairly quickly, what does that say to you?
One, I think it's probably a good thing. Wherever you sit on the partisan spectrum, I think it's good to see the budget earlier. It's good to see the General Assembly go ahead and get moving. I think what it says is that they, of course, had a plan beforehand. I mean, it's not like these things get made up out of whole cloth and we just start fresh at the new legislative session. So I think it says there was some work done before. My guess is there were some deals struck on things like Medicaid expansion that we're going to see play out in this budget.
Thanks to the last election, Republicans regained a veto-proof supermajority in the Senate and came up one vote short of that in the House. We've seen that has made a difference, even though it's just a couple of seats here and there. It seems to have made a difference in how the chamber is working and how they're responding to Governor Cooper.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is making a difference. I mean, every seat really does count. You know, we can debate all day long whether there is such thing as a working supermajority. I'm not sure that's a real thing, but it does matter. All these seats matter, particularly when you're pushing this close to supermajority control. So absolutely, this is a different General Assembly than the one we saw last session.
What did you make of, especially on the House side, Speaker Tim Moore deciding to give a little bit more input to some of his colleagues from across the aisle, making some of them even full committee chairmen?
Yeah, right. Heaven forbid, right? So full committee chairman, that's exactly right. I mean, he did give a bit here. I mean, it surprised me. I'm not going to lie and pretend that I saw this coming. I thought it was probably a positive move. We've actually seen a few of those examples this session of, they're not holding hands and singing Kumbaya. This is not the end of partisan politics in North Carolina, nor should it be, frankly. But I think we're seeing maybe a little bit better conversation across the aisle.
And at least on a couple of bills that Governor Roy Cooper had vetoed in the past, he looked at the vote totals this time and decided to let these bills go into law. I'm talking specifically about the bill on rioting and safety in hotels. Those were very similar to pieces of legislation he has vetoed in the past. Didn't do that this time.
No, the math is different, right? All they need, of course, is to get one Democrat to come over. There's 3 or 4 folks that most folks are eyeing and saying will probably come over. I think Roy Cooper is a strategic politician. He's smart. He is probably not going to veto something if he's going to lose the veto override, and it's something that isn't going to play well for his party in the next election.
What do you think Roy Cooper's strategy is now for the rest of the legislative session? This is his last 2-year cycle as governor. He could do a Jim Hunt and come back later at some point if he wanted to, but he can't run again this time. What do you think his goal is?
I think his goal is probably to finish up as much as he can. I think he's going to look at Medicaid expansion as being the real capper to his career as governor. That was something he's been pushing for years. He helped get it through, and he helped get it through in a very difficult partisan environment for that. So I don't think he can do a lot. Our governor is by design extremely weak, by some measures the weakest governor in the entire country. So there's not much he can do other than play politics, and he's done that pretty well.
The Medicaid expansion bill is basically sailed through, but it won't take effect unless there's actually a passed budget. And we know from recent history that there have been years when they haven't passed a budget. And if they don't, the old budget remains in effect. What sort of political pressure does this place on the various parties to get a budget deal done?
Yeah, I think it places it right squarely at the feet of Roy Cooper. This is set up perfectly for the Republican almost supermajority. I think if the budget does not get passed, it's not going to look good for Cooper. I'm very, very interested to see what the House budget looks like next week. Of course, Governor Cooper's put out his budget, but as somebody once told me, governors' budgets are very, very valuable. Where else are you going to find a doorstop in Raleigh?
Exactly right. The governor is not the one who actually passes the budget. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about how much policy is going to be in this budget. We know the budget's going to have dollars and cents. It's going to tell you where the money's going to get spent. How much policy do you think gets thrown in there with the legislators saying, hey, Governor Cooper, we know you want Medicaid expansion. What else are you going to take?
That's the $10,000 question, right? I tend to think there's going to be a lot of policy in there. Of course, the budget itself is a political document and makes policy, those policy choices matter where the dollars and cents are spent, but I think we're going to see more than that. We've certainly seen that the last few cycles. We saw that when the Democrats were in charge too. So I do think we're going to see a lot of items that the average person might not think would belong in a budget bill.
It'll be interesting to see. One thing we haven't seen yet and might not see for a while, but we know we will see them, is another round of election maps. We know that this General Assembly is going to redraw a congressional election map, probably also a state Senate map, maybe even the state House map, depending on what comes out of the courts. What are you looking for there?
As you said, it's going to happen. Certainly, it has to happen for Congress. I think it's likely to happen. Everybody thinks it's likely to happen in the General Assembly. I think we're going to see some pretty aggressive maps. I think that if I were Jeff Jackson, I'd be making sure that I was renting and not purchasing a house in Washington, D.C. If I were Wiley Nickel, I'd be a little bit nervous. I think Kathy Manning perhaps could be a little bit nervous. I think it's pretty clear where the targets are on the congressional side. On the General Assembly side, I think we're going to see probably some pretty aggressive maps too. The other question, of course, is when. Are we going to see it this summer? Are we going to see it maybe in the fall? And what does that do to other folks' decisions? So, for example, a lot of folks are speculating that Jeff Jackson might run for Attorney General. Well, if the maps don't come out until we've already got a host of other Democrats who have declared, that's going to be a pretty tough thing for Jeff Jackson to do. So of course, it's what the maps look like, but I think the timing is just as critical here.
Before we wrap up, a lot of us who focus on the legislature and what they're up to are in the Raleigh bubble or in the Triangle. You're watching this from afar.
Yeah.
You're out in the western part of the state. How do people approach state government from there? Are people even paying attention?
They're paying attention the way it matters to their pocketbook and to their lives. But the farther you get from the state capital, and this is true in North Carolina, it's true in California, it's true in Alabama, it's true in New York, the farther you get from the state capital, the less trust people have in the state government, the less they know about state government. So I live in Jackson County. We're closer to 5 other state capitals than we are to Raleigh. So it's a very, very different perspective on state politics. So High Point just came out with a poll, not just in the West, but the whole state. And they asked folks, what do you think about all sorts of politicians, right? And so Josh Stein and Mark Robinson were on the list. And about 60% of people in the state have never heard of Mark Robinson. And if you just listen to the Raleigh bubble, you'd think that Mark Robinson is, the Michael Jordan of North Carolina politics, and it's just not true. People aren't clued in to the TikTok. They don't understand the difference between the long session and the short session. It's a very different media environment. It's a different information environment.
What does that mean then for people who operate here in Raleigh as they're thinking about, all right, how do we get these messages to people who aren't paying attention to all of this stuff all the time?
Yeah, I think one thing is to step back, and I feel like sometimes we, and I'm guilty of this as well, almost start mid-conversation, as if people know what a lieutenant governor is, or that people know that there are 170 seats in both houses of the General Assembly. I think we need to do more, I hate to use this word, but explainers. We need to begin the conversation a little bit earlier. Internet access, people say, well, now with Twitter and with media in general, you can get news, the internet online. But if internet access is bad in the West, that's a harder thing to do. And I think we need to remember also that the media markets are split out west. So depending on where you are in the western part of the state, you might get a TV signal from Atlanta, Chattanooga, Knoxville, or Greenville, Spartanburg. There's only one channel in Asheville, and the Asheville Citizen-Times doesn't go farther west than Haywood County. So it is difficult, and I think we need to remember that the shorthand doesn't work.
Well, one person who does a good job of explaining these issues to the folks out in the western part of the state is our guest. He is Western Carolina University political science professor Chris Cooper. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.